Okay, so we're diving into AI and buildings, and wow, you've given us a lot to unpack here. I have to say, what struck me right away was just how many different ways AI is being used.
Yeah, it really is all over the place, isn't it?
It's like energy efficiency and then tenant experience, even like streamlining how we get building permits approved.
hmm
This is like AI is poking its head into every single part of a building's existence.
It really is striking how broad these applications are. And you're right, all those different angles are covered in these sources we have. But what I found myself thinking about even more was how all this tech stuff bumps up against the human side of buildings. You know what I mean? Like that buildings article we have, they really hit on something important with the whole skills gap in facility management.
Yeah, that one made me stop and think.
Like, it's not just about knowing how to fix a leaky faucet anymore, is
Yeah,
it?
no, exactly.
It's a whole new ballgame. They were saying a bunch of experienced workers are leaving,
Right.
and the folks replacing them, they're getting hit from both sides.
Oof. Yeah, having to deal with more complicated buildings than ever, and on top of it, having to learn all this new AI stuff.
It's a double whammy.
Yeah.
And that's why that article's point about the opportunity here really resonated with me. Like, what if we could use AI to grab all the knowledge these experienced people have before they retire? We could make this system that's basically like downloading their brains,
Oh, wow.
and then the next generation has access to that. It's like having a digital mentor right there in the building.
I love that. A digital mentor. Because it would be such a shame to lose all that experience.
Right. And this need for skilled workers goes hand in hand with all these prop tech companies popping up. Have you noticed that?
Oh, yeah.
All these companies promising to like totally revolutionize real estate with fancy technology.
It's everywhere you look now,
It is.
especially from those JLL and CBRE articles we have. It feels like they're putting a lot of their chips on AI, streamlining that.
They want to streamline everything.
Yeah, from finding the right property to managing it, making it more sustainable.
Right.
But then you read that Commercial Observer article, and it's like, hold on a sec.
Reality check.
Yeah, we're getting ahead of ourselves here.
Well, they make a really good point about this AI washing thing. Just because a company slaps AI on something doesn't mean they're actually using it right.
Right.
And that can totally backfire. People get disappointed, they get skeptical.
It's like those early websites back in the day. They promised you the world, but then nothing.
Yeah. So what are some of the real roadblocks these prop tech companies got to figure out? What's holding them back?
Well, the Commercial Observer made this really interesting comparison. They said, imagine if your iPhone could only talk to other iPhones.
Oh,
That's kind of what it's like in a lot of buildings today. All these systems, they don't talk to each other.
interesting. So you might have incredible AI, but if it can't get all the information it needs,
It's useless.
right. Like trying to make a cake with only half the ingredients. Exactly. We need these systems to be talking to each other, sharing data. Then we can actually use AI to make buildings way more efficient.
Makes sense. And that brings us to the Department of Energy report. And all this talk about GEBs, those grid interactive efficient buildings. Honestly, when I first saw that term, I was like, whoa, that's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful,
All right.
but it's actually a pretty simple idea when you break it down. Picture a building that can actually communicate with the power grid
Oh, okay.
and adjust how much energy it's using based on what's happening on the grid.
So it's like these buildings become part of a giant team, all working together to balance the electricity load.
Right. So let's say there's a huge spike in energy demand. Maybe it's a super hot day and everyone's blasting their AC. The GEB can sense that and actually dial back its own energy use,
Wow.
or even feed energy back into the grid if it has solar panels. And this is where AI comes in with that predictive analytics stuff. It learns from all the data about how the building has been used in the past and uses that to guess what's going to happen in the future.
So it's not just reacting to what's happening right now, but actually planning ahead, being proactive.
Exactly. And the Department of Energy is really gung-ho about this whole GEB thing. They see it as a super important step toward making our power grid way more resilient and efficient, especially as we rely more and more on renewable energy. But to pull it off, we need to collect and analyze mountains of data, which takes us back to those integrated building systems we were talking about.
It all comes back around.
It does.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
But let's zoom in for a sec from these big picture energy grids and talk about something a little closer to home for most people building permits. That article about Austin's pilot program in Smart Cities World caught my eye. Using AI to make that whole process less of a headache. Sign me up.
It's definitely an interesting use of AI. automating the reviews, speeding up approvals, cutting down on all the back and forth.
Sounds amazing.
Sounds fantastic in theory.
Yeah.
But the article also points out that we need to think about the potential downsides, too.
Right, because sometimes going fast means cutting corners.
Yeah.
And that's not always a good thing. What were some of the potential problems they mentioned?
Well, for one, they talked about equity. Like, will smaller developers be able to keep up with a more tech-driven process? They might not have the resources, so it could end up widening the gap between the big guys and the little guys.
That's a really good point. And it kind of goes back to something you were talking about earlier, remembering the humans in the middle of all this technology.
Exactly. The JLL article emphasizes that. They're saying, don't get so caught up in the AI tools that you forget about the actual people who'll be using these buildings.
Right. It's got to work for humans, not just robots.
Exactly. And they gave that great example of Accenture's office in Chicago using data and AI to design a space that works for both people who are in the office and people who are working remotely. It's like finding that balance. Technology should make our lives better, not more complicated. Couldn't agree more. And speaking of finding the right balance, that WeWork article is interesting, isn't it?
The WeWork article?
Yeah.
What about it?
Well, after everything they've gone through, they're putting their money on this idea that more and more people are going to want flexible workspaces, especially out in the suburbs.
Interesting. So they're going from being the disruptor to being the platform for other smaller co-working companies.
Exactly. And they're using their technology and their name recognition to make it happen. It's like they're adapting. And you know what's funny? This whole data-driven approach is similar to what VTS is doing.
VTS.
That other prop tech company from the articles. They're giving landlords and tenants all these insights based on data to help them make smarter decisions.
Huh. So data really is king in this world, isn't it?
It's powerful stuff.
It's wild how this data thing just keeps coming up.
Right.
Like, it's the connecting piece between all these different parts of AI and buildings.
It really is the common thread, isn't it? Whether we're talking about making buildings use energy better or streamlining those building permits or even designing spaces that actually work for humans, it all comes back to using data in a smart way.
And that brings us back to those GEs the Department of Energy is so excited about, those buildings that can talk to the power grid. It just seems like to make that work, you'd need an insane amount of data going back and forth.
Oh, absolutely. For those GEs to actually do what they're supposed to, the AI needs to be constantly drinking from that fire hose of information, you know?
It's a lot.
Real-time data about how much energy is being used, what the weather's doing, even how many people are in the building.
Wow, I never thought about it like that.
It's like we're trying to give the building a whole new sense, almost like a sixth sense, so it can tell what's going on at the grid and react in real time.
That's a cool way to think about it. It
Yeah.
really makes you realize just how much data a building must create every second of every day. It's like a living thing almost.
It is kind of like that, isn't it? And the Department of Energy report even hints at how massive this could get. We're not just talking about individual buildings here.
Right.
They're thinking whole cities, with
Yeah.
all these buildings connected, forming this giant intelligent energy ecosystem.
Whoa. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around,
It is pretty mind-blowing.
but it's also incredibly cool when you think about what that could mean. Imagine if blackouts were like a thing of the past because all the buildings were working together to keep things balanced.
Exactly. And it goes even further than just preventing blackouts. Think about how much less we'd have to rely on fossil fuels if our buildings were just smarter about how they use energy. That's the big dream that AI and data are pushing us toward.
It makes you wonder if all this will actually change how we design buildings in the future.
How so?
Like, will we start building them from day one with these data-driven systems already baked in?
I think we're already starting to see that shift happen. Developers and architects are realizing that trying to add stuff later is way harder.
It's like anything else.
Yeah,
It's better to just do it right the first time.
exactly. And that brings up another really important point, the whole collaboration aspect. The Department of Energy report stresses this a lot. To make this whole smart, interconnected energy grid a reality, everyone needs to be on board.
Like what kind of everyone?
Everyone. The government, the utility companies, the building owners, even the people who rent or work in those buildings, we all have to be working together.
It's like they say it takes a village.
It really does. No single group can do this alone. We need open communication people sharing data and everyone willing to embrace these new ways of thinking about how we design, build, and operate our buildings.
Yeah, and hopefully that same collaborative spirit can go beyond just energy efficiency too.
Yeah.
Like maybe it can help us figure out how to make buildings more sustainable and make sure everyone has access to these technologies.
That's a great point. And that circles right back to that core idea, the human element that we keep coming back to. That JLL article really drives this home.
How so?
Well, they make a really strong argument that as much as we love these shiny new AI tools, we can't lose sight of the fact that real people are the ones who actually have to live and work in these buildings.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's not about buildings for robots. It's got to work for us humans.
Exactly. And they use this term digital equity that I think is really important.
Digital equity, what is that?
So in this context, it means making sure that everybody, no matter their income or their background or even how tech savvy they are, has the same opportunities to benefit from all the advantages that AI can bring to buildings.
Oh, okay, so it's not enough to just give people access to the technology itself. They need the skills and knowledge to actually use it too.
Exactly. It's about closing that gap, making sure everyone can benefit from this tech revolution, not just a select few.
And that takes us all the way back to that skills gap we were talking about earlier.
Full circle.
It all connects.
It does. If we want buildings of the future to work for everybody, then we got to make sure everybody has a chance to learn and participate in this technological revolution.
That's a really good point. And it actually makes me think about something else that's been coming up a lot in these articles. This whole idea of how the line between physical spaces and digital spaces is getting blurrier.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like with so many people working remotely and all this talk about virtual reality and even the metaverse, it seems like those two worlds are kind of blending together.
They're totally merging, and it's super interesting to think about the opportunities and challenges that come with that.
Like what?
Well, for one, how do we design buildings that seamlessly combine those physical and digital experiences in a way that feels natural and intuitive?
Right. And how do we make sure these digitally enhanced spaces are still accessible and inclusive to everybody? It's a lot to think about.
It is.
But I got to say, these articles have given us a lot to chew on.
For sure.
And one thought that keeps coming back to me is that ultimately, the future of buildings isn't just about technology.
Okay.
It's about finding these new and innovative ways to make the human experience better.
I love that.
It really
Yeah.
makes you think about what it'll actually feel like to be inside those buildings of the future, once all the tech is in place.
That's such a key point. It's easy to get lost in the weeds with all the cool technology and forget that buildings are ultimately spaces for humans.
Right.
People have to live and work in these places.
And hopefully enjoy being there too.
Exactly. And it made me think about that analogy from the Commercial Observer article, remember?
Which one?
About how all the systems in a building are like iPhones that can't talk to each other.
Oh, yeah. They were talking about data silos.
Right. But it made me realize the same thing could happen with the user experience, too.
What do you mean?
Like, imagine if you had this super high-tech apartment, but you needed a different app to control every little thing.
Oh, God.
One for the lights, one for the temperature, one for the blinds. It would drive you crazy.
Ugh, it would be awful. I can barely keep track of the apps I have now.
Right. And that's the opposite of what we want. The last thing we need is to create these buildings that are super advanced on paper, but a total pain to actually use.
Totally. So how do we avoid that?
Well, that's why I thought that example of Accenture's office was so interesting.
The flexible one in Chicago.
Yeah. They really seem to put the human experience front and center,
Yeah.
They got input from the people who'd be using the space use data to understand how people actually work. It's a good reminder that technology should make our lives easier, not harder.
For sure. And it kind of goes back to what we were saying about the lines between physical and digital spaces becoming blurry. As our lives become more digitally focused, shouldn't the buildings we use be able to keep up?
Absolutely. We have to start thinking about how to design spaces that can adapt and change along with us. Spaces that are flexible, intuitive, and maybe even a little bit fun to be in.
Okay, I like that. So how does AI fit into all of this?
Well, imagine a building that could actually learn your preferences over time.
My preferences.
Yeah, like what temperature you prefer, the lighting you like best, even the music you want to listen to. And then it could automatically adjust the environment to create this perfectly personalized experience for you.
Okay, now that sounds straight out of a science fiction movie.
I know, right?
But it also kind of makes me wonder about the privacy implications.
How so?
Well, these buildings are constantly collecting data about our preferences and how we're using the space. Does that mean we're giving up some of our privacy?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's something we have to be very careful about as we move towards this more data-driven future. Transparency is key.
Transparency.
Yeah. Building owners and operators need to be upfront about what data they're collecting, how they're using it, and what they're doing to protect people's privacy.
It's like with anything else. It all comes down to trust.
Exactly. If people don't feel like their privacy is being respected, they're going to be really hesitant to embrace any of this technology, no matter how cool or convenient it might seem.
That makes sense. So what can we do? That
Yeah.
feels like a pretty big issue.
It is a big issue, but it's not insurmountable. I think the most important thing is to have these conversations now while we're still in the early stages. We need to establish clear guidelines, ethical frameworks, best practices for the industry, that kind of thing.
So it's not just on the tech companies to figure this out.
Definitely not. We all have a role to play here. As citizens, as consumers, as professionals working in this industry, we need to stay informed, ask the tough questions, and demand better from the people creating these technologies.
I like that. We can all be part of the solution.
Exactly. The future of buildings isn't set in stone. It's something we're all creating together through the choices we make.
That's a really good point.
So let's be thoughtful about it. Let's engage in these conversations. Let's consider the implications of these technologies before they become so embedded in our lives that it's too late to change course.
I completely agree. And if we can do that, I feel really optimistic about the future of our built environment. We can harness the power of AI to create buildings that are not only smart and efficient, but also human-centered, sustainable, and equitable. That's the goal, right?
It's the dream. And I, for one, am really excited to see what we build next.
Me too. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks for taking the time to really dig into these articles with me.
Of course, this was fun.
And thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into the world of AI and buildings. We'll catch you next time.